as much from the knowledge of the public as possible. This possessed the heads of the people very much, and few cared to go through Drury Lane or the other streets suspected, unless they had extraordinary business that obliged them to it. This increase of the bills stood thus: the usual number of burials in a week in the parishes of St. Giles in the Fields and St. Andrew's Holborn were from 12 to 17 or 19 each, few more or less. But from the time that the plague first began in St. Giles parish, it was observed that the ordinary burials increased in number considerably. For example, from December 27 to January 3, St. Giles 16, St. Andrew 17. From January 3 to January 10, St. Giles 12, St. Andrews 25. From January 10 to January 17, St. Giles 18, St. Andrews 18. From January 17 to January 24, St. Giles 23, St. Andrews 16. From January 24 to January 31, St. Giles 24, St. Andrews 15. From January 30 to February 7, St. Giles 21, St. Andrews 23. From February 7 to February 14, St. Giles 24, whereof one of the plague. The like increase of the bills was observed in the parishes of St. Bride's, adjoining on one side of Holborn parish, and in the parish of St. James, Clerkenwell, adjoining on the other side of Holborn, in both which parishes the usual numbers that died weekly were from 4 to 6 or 8, whereas at that time they were increased as follows. From December 20 to December 27, St. Bride's 0, St. James 8. From December 27 to January 3, St. Bride's 6, St. James 9. From January 3 to January 10, St. Bride's 11, St. James 7. From January 10 to January 17, St. Bride's 12, St. James 9. From January 17 to January 24, St. Bride's 9, St. James 15. From January 24 to January 31, St. Bride's 8, St. James 12. From January 31 to February 7, St. Bride's 13, St. James 5. From February 7 to February 14, St. Bride's 12, St. James 6. Besides this, it was observed with great uneasiness by the people that the weekly bills in general increased very much during these weeks, although it was at a time of the year when usually the bills are very moderate. The usual number of burials within the bills of mortality for a week was from about 240 or thereabouts to 300. The last was esteemed a pretty high bill, but after this we found the bills successively increasing as follows. December the 20th to the 27th, buried 291, increased, not available. December the 27th to the 3rd January, buried 349, increased 58. January the 3rd to the 10th January, buried 394, increased 45. January the 10th to the 17th January, buried 415, increased 21. January the 17th to the 24th January, buried 474, increased 59. This last bill was really frightful, being a higher number than had been known to have been buried in 1 week since the preceding visitation of 1656. However, all this went off again, and the weather proving cold, and the frost, which began in December, still continuing very severe, even till near the end of February, attended with sharp though moderate winds, the bills decreased again, and the city grew healthy, and everybody began to look upon the danger as good as over, only that still the burials in St. Giles continued high.